James, he just gave me the funniest image in my head because we had to think about children listeners for a minute. I'm imagining a daycare center with us playing over the speakers.
Those children would be glued to the whatever device they were listening on.
Do you get aroused by stimulating intellectual conversation? Are you turned on by the idea of engaging with thought leaders from across the United States? Do you go gaga over exploring important ideas from influential books, research, and essays? Then welcome to Curiosity Porn, the place you can satisfy all those intellectual urges guilt-free. Your hosts are Dr. Guy Crane, Professor of Philosophy at Rose State College, and Professor James Davenport, Professor of Political Science at Rose State College. However, the views expressed here are solely the views of the hosts and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. And now, here are James and Guy.
James.
How are you doing, Guy?
I am okay. I am enjoying that it is not unbearably hot outside.
It's
even
still
though
a little warmer than I would like.
I think you have the interesting banter topic this time. You came from the land of the flood.
Yes, I was in Davidson, North Carolina, which really was not hit super bad by the hurricane that came through. There were some large tree branches that were strewn around and stuff like that, but I didn't see any major structural damage or anything like that.
And what were you doing?
I was doing a presentation out there for them on fostering viewpoint diversity and constructive disagreement and civil discourse on college campuses. So, yeah.
The pictures, though, of the part of the state that is hit is just insane. The flood damage.
And I will say, Davidson College has a beautiful campus. I mean, just absolutely gorgeous.
Well, it's heart-wrenching. So I've got family in North Carolina, and we've traveled and actually stayed in a cabin in the exact part of the probably the epicenter of all the damage.
Mm-hmm.
And what's so sad is that is absolutely gorgeous. And now I don't know how much of it is still gorgeous or not. Anyway, that's tragic. I hope things improve for them.
Yes, it sounds like it's going to be tough sledding for a little while, though.
Yeah,
Asheville was hit particularly hard.
I think one of the craziest pictures I saw was somebody was on the I-40 overpass looking at a state highway, and it was just underwater. There was just no highway there anymore. Yeah. That was crazy. On a brighter note, we have a pretty great guest today. Would you say that?
Yeah, I would. If you forced me to. No, he's awesome.
What's your
one of our favorite philosophers. Could we say that?
I think we could do that.
Okay.
Let's do the introduction, but then I've got a surprise question for our guest, actually. Dr. Jerry Green is in the house with us today. He is a philosophy professor at the University of Central Oklahoma, where he teaches philosophy and ancient Greek. He specializes in ancient Greek philosophy, but is also interested in contemporary virtue ethics and virtue epistemology, and the overlap between epistemology and teaching and learning. And for our non-philosophy guests, we might do some work and define some terms maybe as we go. Jerry, first, just welcome to the program.
Hey, guys. Hey, friends.
What's
up?
We will definitely be dropping first names because instead of Dr. anything, because full disclosure to our listeners, we've known each other for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. And I just got to say, y'all don't understand the pressure when your friends tell you hey, we're starting a podcast. Because I was like, it's going to be bad and I'm going to have to listen to it. And so I've listened to every episode. I'm a huge fan. So very excited.
Are we getting better as we go along?
I hope so.
Do you think?
I mean, I guess you guys hit the ground running. I thought it was pretty solid.
Fair enough.
From the get-go.
Well, I thought it would be worth pointing out, just for entertainment value, how you and I met. Do you want to say something about that?
Go for it.
Oh, me?
You tell the story, yeah.
Well, I just wanted to make sure that you correct me where I'm off. So I would graduate students, some majors, some not majors, and they would transfer over up to your neck of the woods at UCO and take classes with you. And here's at least how I remember it. They were asking both of us, actually, I think, do we know each other? And what's hilarious is it was not necessarily because we were philosophers.
Right. Right. No, I can think of at least two. It might have been three different students. And it wasn't even like, oh, surely it's like they just took for granted. You guys are already friends. You must hang out. And then like, who is this person you're talking about? Like, what do you mean you don't already? Like, you're not neighbors and like go fishing on weekends. Of course you're best friends already.
And the reason was not philosophy, but why?
It was in-class body language and too many memes in class, I think.
Okay.
Too many jokes in class.
I thought
That's
it was
what I
also just
remember.
similar appearance. Like,
Yeah.
you guys look alike.
Well, it was particular. There's like, we all have those tics that you do
Right.
in class. And I think we have some of the same ones. I think that was like that exact, like the way you pause, like hand gestures and stuff. I think that was what tipped them off.
Yeah.
first.
Anyway, they would come back and ask me too, some of our students. And, now looking back, I'm tempted to say like, oh yeah, we know each other from the secret white guy with glasses who has tics in class meetings,
Mhm.
I just want you to know how difficult, you probably already do, but how difficult it was for guys. We were putting questions together, not to have a whole bunch of Plato questions. I mean, dealing with ancient
turns
Greek,
out
Mhm.
it's not difficult to sidestep Plato altogether. We still have to do the rapid fire.
Yes, we do.
Mhm.
We absolutely do. We got a bevy of questions just to hit you real quick with. First of all, how'd you get into academia?
So I always knew I was going to be a teacher from like second grade.
Really?
Always. Yeah. So it was just, I get to sixth grade. Oh, middle school, I might teach that. You get to high school. Oh, high school, I might teach that. So then I got to college and it was this weird tutorial-based program. It's the only one in the country that works the way it does, where you have to apply into a particular program. And then it's all like independent studies, basically, the tutorial program. And philosophy was one of the programs that they had. There were some other things I was interested in that they didn't have. And I didn't know how to choose between history, English, social, whatever. It's like, oh, philosophy is a little bit everything. I guess I'll do that. And then first day of class, my professor was an ancient philosophy guy. So we did Plato on, the first day.
Yeah.
Oh,
Did he dress up like Plato?
he does not dress up as Plato.
Oh,
No, he is
okay.
not as good as some other Plato teachers that I know.
All right. What's one interesting thing you're currently reading, listening to, or watching? Your pick.
So I have been struggling to read lately, I will admit. I've been reading a lot. I'm prepping a new class in the spring, like a early Christian humanities class, which is like history and art, like art history stuff. So I've been reading a couple of books for that, just to look for a textbook, bone up. But I guess there's a website, there's a blog that's been really good. I've been kind of binging back catalog stuff. It's called A Collection of Unmitigated Pedantry.
Okay.
Yeah, which is, I must say, not my favorite title, but the content is amazing. He's a Roman historian, and he does some really good, like what's supposed to be a 5-part series, and each part will have 3 parts. So just, encyclopedic looks, like deep dives in all sorts of stuff. And he first got on my radar because he does these sort of Lord of the Rings or like Game of Thrones, like what a siege was actually like, or what armor would have been like versus how they do it, what they got right, what they got wrong. And he's been going for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years. I literally went back to first post and I've just been going through. So I think I just last night got up to the year 2024.
So it sounds like you are a man who thinks about the Roman Empire every day.
Yes, I am. Yes, at least lately. Yes, indeed. Indeed.
I'm just going to say, you know what can really spur reading? Start a podcast and invite people on who write a lot of stuff.
Yes.
And then you want to be able to ask
You know
questions.
what? I need more things on my to-do
That's
list.
right.
That's a
That's
great
right.
idea.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Jerry, who is the greatest philosopher of all time?
It's not Aristotle. I actually think he's not a very good political philosopher.
What?
I know. Okay, the correctest political philosopher I'm going to say is Rawls.
Oh, okay.
I like Rawls. It's the only time I've read someone in any area of philosophy. I'm just like, okay, that's right. Problem solved. Moving on. But the greatest political philosopher, I think I want to say Hobbes.
You were not the first person to say that. Wasn't that
who was that? There was somebody else who.
there was somebody. Chris Fryman, wasn't it?
Was it Chris?
I want to say it was. I want to say it was. We were kind of taken aback.
Well, let me tell you why, because I don't like his conclusions. I'm not like absolute monarchist or anything. He starts from nothing.
He does.
And he's
Yeah.
super crystal clear. Like, I'm only as few as possible parts to start with, and I'm going to just build them up in this like super organized and transparent way. So just in terms of method, I think he's really impressive.
All right. Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm having to.
He's
Recalibrate
recovering
that.
from somebody who likes Rawls a little bit is what's going on right
Yeah, I
now.
know.
All right. What's one thing about your work you wish people understood better?
So I don't know if my work is a thing. I'm kind of all over the place. I don't know if I have like a project. So I guess maybe I'll say this. Something about like the value of philosophy in general. I'm a big fan of, there's this, I don't know, movement, I guess, call it philosophy as a way of life, which you'll see in pedagogy circles, which basically says that at least one of the most important things about doing philosophy is it just makes you a better person, lead a better life. And I'm kind of all in on that is what is the value of doing philosophy at all? Like, why is my salary worth taxpayer dollars? Why should students come sign up for my classes? That kind of thing. And that value is one that is awkward to fit into academia as an institution as it is structured. Because like, I like writing papers. When I do it, it's fun, but it always feels like just a little bit self-indulgent. Like of all the, like I could be teaching more students better, or I could be writing a paper that like 4 people are going to read, whatever. So let's say I wish more people understood the framework from which everything else is coming.
All right. Fair enough. All right. What's a belief that you hold that puts you at odds with your peers, colleagues, or family?
I think in terms of moral psychology, I'm just a Stoic. So I don't research the Stoics. I research Aristotle more, and I think his view is better, all things considered. But when it comes to moral psychology, so like the ethics of how we think and how we think about reason versus emotion and things like that, I like the Stoic view, which is also the Kantian view, more or less. It's basically emotions and various non-cognitive things are things that happen to you. They're not really who you are. So they're like these outside things. So that ends up being a pretty negative view on emotions generally and like having fun. I don't really like having fun. And just like for context, my wife is a drama therapist. So like fun is really important and feelings are really important. So it's a sort of ongoing conversation in our household, how those two things ought to be related.
Wow. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't envy you the sorts of, let's say, tiffs that might arise sometimes.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Sure.
Well, let's get to the meat of it. Your specialization is actually in ancient philosophy. You spent your formative years developing expertise in Plato, Aristotle, learning to read and translate ancient Greek. How did you get interested in conspiracy theories, which is what we're here to talk about today?
Yeah, so it's a couple of steps. Like I said, first class that I took in philosophy was an intro class, but it was largely ancient, and I just immediately thought it was amazing. It takes a lot of work to learn Greek to be able to do that work, so there's some sort of investment or sunk costs, you might think. And then once I started teaching, or I guess even before that, I was also interested in ethics, and I like virtue ethics, which is basically a modern, updated version of what Aristotle's doing. So that was the sort of segue into the virtue theory stuff. And then I started teaching at UCO, and I was doing intro to philosophy, and we already had a contemporary moral problems like intro ethics class. So I wanted to make my intro class not be redundant, not overlap with them too much. So I decided to make it an entirely like normative epistemology class. And as part of that class, God, this is a long story, I had to talk about like, why does truth matter and why should you care and why do I think it's subjective and you should too. And so I started working some literature on conspiracy theory into that intro to philosophy class as an argument for why truth matters. And it was being a little facetious, but it's basically either you care about truth or the bad guys win, right? Here are your two options, right? These are the people who don't care about truth. This is how they act. You don't want to be like that, do you? And so it started just, one day in a class, and then it kind of grew to a week of the class. And then I had an opportunity, I don't remember exactly why, but for some reason or other, we had a semester where all of the regular classes were taken, and so I had to come up with a new class of my own. And so I floated doing an entire class on conspiracy theories to fill my teaching load that semester. So I taught that once, and then since then, I've only taught it the one time, but I've continually brought the conspiracy theory stuff back into my intro class, more or less, since then. And then that class was, I might have been 4 years ago at this point, and I always wanted to write a paper on it and just couldn't get the traction, and it was just sitting and sitting and sitting. And so it wasn't until last year that, I don't know what it was, it just something clicked and I finally got that traction. And so I've been sort of more interested in the topic in a research way, not just a teaching way, in the last, I don't know, let's say year or so.
So you kind of answered my next question. I was wondering, you and I, when we talked a long time ago, talking about what was in your intro class, I got really, that piqued my interest, because I'm thinking always in terms of like, what is going to elicit the most interest in students. And if I find some philosophical topic boring, it's going to be really hard to communicate its interestingness to them. So and you were kind of the first to get me thinking, like, I could rope in conspiracy theories. I clearly wanted it just to like dangle something shiny in front of students to make them realize, like, hey, philosophy can be really fun. Actually, I know you're anti-fun, but was there a deeper motivation for this, like why you should care that truth matters? Was there something on your mind when you were trying to put a class together with that kind of learning objective, let's call it?
Yes, I think so. And it's a double-edged sword, because in one sense, like, it's always an issue, right? There's always something going on. It's usually politically. Some new conspiracy theory is popular, or somehow it's on the news, it's a big deal. And so it's a sort of perennial issue. I want to say, I don't know if you guys would even remember this one. It was the Jade Helm conspiracy. I was in grad school at the time, I don't know, 2012, 2014. There was this conspiracy theory that Obama was president at the time, and he was using these military maneuvers in Texas. I can't remember if it was the Texas National Guard or federal.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And that was going to be a secret invasion. The U.S. was going to invade itself, and they were going to start with Texas. And also somehow Walmart was renovating all of their restrooms at the same time. Right. And those were like these underground secret tunnels for these, I don't know, concentration camps to round up all the conservatives.
Now it's ringing a bell. Yeah.
And I was in Texas at the time when this was happening, and I'm like, what are we talking about? This is so ridiculous. Like, how could you believe this? So that, I think, is where the seed was planted. But then I also think there's some interesting, at least what I thought at the time, some interesting features of the way that people who tend to gravitate towards conspiracy theorists, the way they think, that I thought was examples of other things that we were talking about in class, like some cognitive bias stuff, some social epistemology stuff. So it was a one concrete area where all of these various class topics kind of all intersected, that also happened to be sort of interesting. Because I know you've had this experience too. You just mentioned, like, someone will bring up a conspiracy theory randomly in week 2, and you're like, oh yes. And in 2 weeks, we will spend a whole week just on that topic. And just the eyes light up and they're all excited. But then you have to sort of deflate a little bit, kind of pop the balloon of like, yeah, we're not actually talking about lizard people or why the moon landing was. It's not about the theories themselves exactly. Like, that's the fun stuff. It's more about how and why you get there. But at least in my experience, they do like the topic. They do get into it.
I was just wondering, this is off script a bit, but have you ever thought about doing a special class or a seminar or something for elected officials? I'm just saying.
Yeah.
There might be some real value to that.
Mm-hmm. And this goes back to why I teach this stuff in the first place. A class like that, I worry, would be useless because the people who need to hear it don't want to hear it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That could
So
be.
you gotta start a couple of steps back. So basically, my intro class, the learning objective is make you a better. I can't make you a better person. Give you the tools to help you walk the path to make yourself a better person. And you have to want to do that and see why it is important first.
Yeah,
And that takes some work.
No, I agree.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so your work on this topic concerns the debate among philosophers about how exactly to define conspiracy theory. And apparently, there are two camps in this debate. So, can you give us what you call the generalist understanding of a conspiracy?
Yeah, so the generalist view is, I would say it's the default view among most people. If you just go ask around non-philosophers. So it's the view that as a class or as a category, conspiracy theories are inherently suspect. So not that they're necessarily all false, but they're probably irrational, probably unjustified, just given what it is to be a conspiracy theory in the first place. So there's a very high probability any theory that gets the label conspiracy theory, it's very likely to be wrong. You probably shouldn't believe it.
Okay. All right. So the other camp is the particularists, right? And what is their beef with the generalist? What do they not like about that definition? And what's their alternative definition of conspiracy theory?
So the particularists think that the generalists are, I guess, in a sense, too willing to believe that conspiracy theories are irrational. So instead of starting with your sort of just everyday use of the term and working from there, I think the particularists, they want to go more case by case basis. And if you sort of dig into individual instances, you'll see that a lot of what were labeled conspiracy theories ended up being right, or at least probable, or not crazy or something. So it's a little bit more like generalists are sort of top down. I think particularists are more bottom up. And at least the folks that I've read, at least among philosophers, they tend to start, I think, in the mid 2000s, 2010s decades, sort of basically post 9/11. And I think there's this historical moment where they were motivated by things like people saying sort of criticisms of sort of the Iraq War and sort of post 9/11 political stuff in the US and in the UK. The label conspiracy theory was used as a kind of cudgel to get basically anti-war protesters to shut up. Like, don't pay attention to them. It was this like rhetorical move, right? And they feel that they were basically vindicated. And so it's almost like stacking the deck by calling something a conspiracy theory. It automatically makes it suspect in a way that's kind of rhetorically unfair.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to say instead, just, they're particular risks, because you got to be particular about each one, just like evaluate each one on its merits. Some of them will be like, lizard people, probably false. I don't know, the CIA was trying to assassinate some South American leader in the 60s, probably true. That happened a couple of times. We got good evidence for that one. So you can't make any sweeping claims about the probability of any given conspiracy theory. It's way more complicated than that.
Okay, so I'm guessing they've got a less negative definition.
Yeah. So one way you can think about this, I find it really interesting. The generalists, people who are generalists, tend to be representative of other fields. So some philosophers, it's mainly like psychologists and historians and social scientists. Most of the folks who endorse particularism are philosophers, and they have so they're basically focused on what makes something a conspiracy theory in the first place. So you have this one level is, are conspiracy theories more or less probable inherently? And to answer that, they'll say, well, I don't know what's a conspiracy theory in the first place. Let's focus there first. So the particularists will basically define a conspiracy as any, I guess, two or more people working together in secret with some sort of specific goal in mind that they don't want people to know about. And so that's what a conspiracy. So that's their theory of what a conspiracy is, right? Just two or more people acting in secret with a goal. And so a conspiracy theory is just any theory about that, any theory about a conspiracy. Right? So it's much more open-ended, I think much more broad, much more inclusive than the generalist definition.
Yeah, that is a broad definition. A lot of mundane stuff is going to count, right? Surely particulars got to know that. How do they respond to the fact that their view implies that something like a surprise birthday party or wondering if there's a surprise birthday party, we can call that a conspiracy theory? What would they, because that just sounds like nobody talks like that. What do they say in response to that?
Yeah. So actually, let me give a couple of examples just to make sure people sort of see how this is going. So yeah, as you mentioned, your parents are trying to throw you a surprise party. So two people acting in secret, they have a goal of throwing a party for you. They don't want you to find out. So that's a conspiracy. Another example I've used, you have a professor and a TA, and they're working to anonymously grade student work. And they don't want people to know whose grades are out yet until they're all graded in case they need to curve it or something. So two people with a goal acting in secret. That's a conspiracy. Just anything where you're trying to keep something from someone, like, oh, I heard an embarrassing rumor about you and I don't want you to find out because it's going to hurt your feelings. And so I talked to all of our other friends to be like, hey, don't tell them that because it'd be very upsetting. Many people working in secret with a goal. It's not just friendship, it's a conspiracy. So yeah, it's a really broad definition. A lot of things count, in particular things that aren't that nefarious, right? Lots of just everyday stuff. And also not particularly, like unusual. It's not just government agents or spies or, like people you've never heard of in clandestine rooms with like secret handshakes and stuff. Just everybody's doing it. And about stuff that just happens all the time. So on their view, if you take this sort of minimal, fairly broad definition of what counts as a conspiracy, there's a lot of conspiracies. Right? And they're totally fine with that. And in fact, they sort of use this to motivate their case. Be like, yeah, if you think if you get wind of it, you suspect your parents are throwing you a surprise party. Not irrational to think that. Right? Your children at some point, sorry if there are any children listening, you might suspect that Santa Claus is a game your parents are playing to give you presents, right? Believing that there's a conspiracy that my parents are saying presents are from Santa when they really aren't. That's rational to think that at some point. So when if those sorts of things count as conspiracies, there's a lot of them. So many of these things, in fact, actually happen. And then two, believing that those things are actually happening is completely normal, completely rational, given the evidence most people have. And that just goes to show that conspiracy theories aren't inherently weird or inherently irrational, right? There's just a lot of them. And so they would then argue back against the generalist. If all of those cases we just talked about, if your theory says those are inherently suspect, your theory is just giving the wrong results and it's got to be wrong.
James, he just gave me the funniest image in my head because we had to think about children listeners for a minute. I'm imagining a daycare center with us playing over the speakers.
Those children would be glued to the whatever device they were listening on.
Immediately turn off SpongeBob SquarePants.
All of a sudden, they'll be talking by Plato or well, maybe not Plato. But,
turn off the skibbity-doo toilet.
John Locke,
right.
Yeah.
I gotta say just real quick, one of my favorite podcasts is called Ologies. And it's just like all of these weird different sciences. They interview scientists. It's really cool. And they've got a spinoff one called Smologies, which is ologies for kids.
Okay.
So yes, a curiosity porn for kids spinoff. I think
we could start that. We could start curiosity porn for kids. I bet it would be wildly popular.
I'm yes. Here's what I believe. Those children would perform better in school if they were.
Now
I'm
that
just
I would
saying.
stand by. That I would stand by.
Okay.
I would. Okay.
So parents, if you want your children to be smart students,
you got to get them some curiosity porn
for kids.
For kids, yes. Okay. So it sounds like particulars just bite the bullet. If you tell them like, look, your definition includes stuff that like nobody thinks of that as a conspiracy theory. They just say like, yep, that's true. Next thing. So you're not. Just showing them more and more cases of silly things that count seems like it's not going to go anywhere. you think this still puts them in a problematic spot, right? Like they can't just bite the bullet and have it their way. That there's still leading. That it's going to lead to problems. And you, in fact, argue that there's 3 serious problems where this goes. What are those?
Okay, I gotta say something about meta philosophy first. I'm sorry. I apologize in advance. Okay, so philosophy is already weird enough. Meta philosophy is doing philosophy about philosophy. This is why we're so popular at parties. So I mentioned earlier, when I first taught this class, I was trying to find some way to write a paper because I don't like the particularist definition. I didn't have a great, like, clear, this is what this rubs me the wrong way. This just doesn't sound right. And I just could get no traction on how to engage with them. Right? And the reason why that is sort of exactly as you said, you can't give counterexamples to the view as they define it. And you're like, well, surely that doesn't count. So normally, one of the main tools that philosophers have, you give a definition and you show that it doesn't work by giving some sort of counterexample, right? So here's 3 criteria that have to meet to satisfy X. Well, here's an example that satisfies all 3, doesn't count as X, or it still counts as X even though it doesn't satisfy all 3, or something like that. And you just can't do it with the particularist view because they are so not just willing to let so many things count, but they think it's an advantage of their view that they let so many things count. It's dialectically useful because they use it to argue against generalists on the basis of them counting out too many things. So I just had a really hard time finding a way to argue with them productively because just, I don't like that. Not, even if I don't like the view, just saying that seems wrong is not enough for a paper.
I will say, I occasionally feel like I do read a published paper that doesn't have a whole lot more going for it.
Yeah, well, maybe they're better at the setup versus the swing than I am. I don't know.
Probably read some student papers.
or the peer reviewers were just real drowsy that day or something.
You know what? That is fair. That is fair. Well, I aspire to higher standards than that.
Good on you. Good on you, sir.
Yeah, so what I eventually landed on was trying to sort of argue against the particularist view from the inside. So one of the other advantages the particularists claim for their own view is that they think that the particularist view is better for motivating inquiry. Right? So they critique the generalists because on the generalist view, conspiracy theory is just an automatic conversation stopper. Just this cudgel, right?
It's a problem because it's dismissive. It's just hand wavy.
Yeah. So if something gets labeled as a conspiracy theory, it's automatically improbable. Only dumb people would believe it in the first place. You're crazy for thinking it. So we don't have to pay attention to you. We don't need to waste our time. And maybe also we can, discount your testimony in the public sphere or make the cause you're associated with look worse by association or something like that. And so this goal of promoting inquiry, right? If you have to go case by case basis, then that makes people more willing to look into particular cases and more willing to, I guess, just be open to let the chips fall where they may. And to be clear, they don't think that all conspiracy theories are probable. Just a lot of them can be, and we just need to evaluate each case on the merits, right? And phrased that way, I think that's not a terrible goal to have, right? Inquiry is good. We should look at our evidence and see what makes sense on the merits. And so one problem, though, I think the particularists have is their view is counterproductive to this goal of promoting inquiry. Right? And there's a couple of different reasons for this, but it's all ultimately the same argument, right? Particularism, if we accept it, makes it less likely that we're going to inquire or makes that inquiry less productive than you might think it would, and maybe than the generalist case would. So the particularists aren't reaching their own goals as well as they think they might. So, quick rundown of all 3. One of them, the first one, if the particularists are right, there are just so many conspiracies going on, right? And that makes it really hard to know where to pay attention. On the generalist view, there's not that many conspiracy theories. So if you want to dig into it, you've got like a shorter list of targets to look into. For the particularists, there's just so many. So you're just swamped. You don't even know where to start. You might waste your time with a lot of them that don't work or waste your time with a lot that do. And so it's just like, it doesn't help us kind of narrow down where we want to look.
You just don't have the cognitive resources
Exactly.
to do
Yeah.
all that.
Yeah. It's just overwhelmed, like too much going on. Second problem, because so many everyday activities count as a conspiracy on their view, then all things considered, there's a lot of conspiracies out there on their, by their metric of what counts as a conspiracy. And that means that most conspiracy theories are probably true, right? Because lots of parents have secrets from their kids. Lots of people are doing things without people wanting to know. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And so every time two people are doing something in secret, that's a conspiracy. And anytime someone thinks that's going on, that's a conspiracy theory. So you add up all of those, and you see how many of them are actually happening. And this is sort of an empirical question, but I sure bet if you tallied them all up, most of them would end up being true. And so instead of giving us reason to do the sort of case by case basis, instead, I think we've got this argument to suspect that most of them are actually true. And if so, it's not worth inquiring into them very much because they're likely to be happening anyway.
So the definition is so broad that they include this class that is just the class of stuff that generalists are not interested in. And so the ones that we tend to think of as paradigm cases, like who shot JFK or whatever, those actually become the outliers.
Exactly, yeah.
And so the total class enjoys this like high prior probability just because of what all goes in there.
Yeah, exactly. Like you might think you just, get all the conspiracy theories you can think of, and a third of them will be really improbable, and a third is really hard to tell, and a third of them are pretty likely. And so it kind of balances out, and therefore we got to go case by case. I suspect that that's what the particularists might think would happen. But I think given, like I said, how broad their definition is, I don't know what that number is, 55, 60% of them, 80% of them, the majority of them are likely to be true. There aren't that many really wacky ones out there, like lizard people and, that kind of hollow earth, whatever. The ones that are hard to tell, it's sort of hard to tell, but the majority of them, and maybe the vast majority of them, are going to end up being, if not true, at least very likely, given how low the bar is to count in the first place. And so it's not going to be worth our time making the inquiry in the first place because the odds of its being true are too high to make it worth the effort. It'd be wasted time.
Got it. Okay.
And then the third one is, these are all sort of related. It defines what counts as a conspiracy theory so broadly that it makes it almost trivial. And so this is a sort of mirror image. The particularists think that the generalist view is way too narrow. Not enough things count as a conspiracy. On the particularist view, way too many things count. And so it undermines the usefulness of having the category of conspiracy theory in the first place, right? As a category that's supposed to pick out a relatively limited and manageable set of things that have some interesting properties in common. It just accepts so many things and so many different kinds of things as conspiracies that it's not a useful category anymore. It just makes it it's such a low bar that so many different things count. So what's the point of labeling it a conspiracy at all? And if there's no label for a set of phenomenon, what's the point looking into it?
Okay. Yeah. Why? If you're going to parse things such that we can't even see the borderlines in any direction, what uses that map, right?
Yeah. It'd be like, I don't know if this is a very good analogy or not, but think about colors. If I'm like asking how many green things are there? It's like, okay, well, that's a hard, there's different colors and it shades into yellow, so whatever. So maybe we can't answer that, but at least we know it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. It's like, okay, well, how many colors are there? What things are colored? Like, well, all of the things are colored, right? If everything goes into that bucket, or too many things go in that bucket, it's just not, like, it doesn't discriminate in the right way. It doesn't help us sort of navigate the things we're trying to figure out because it just throws in too many different kinds of things. So it's not functional.
Okay, well, let me press you on this just a little bit. You argue that the particularist view of conspiracy is too broad, incorporates things that are not commonly considered as conspiracies, surprise parties. I suppose if we all decided we're getting together after the podcast and we're trying to decide where to go to have dinner, that would count as a conspiracy under, right?
Mm-hmm.
So all those types of things. You also say that the general public doesn't use the term in a way that's consistent with the particular definition. So I want to start with that first point. It seems to me that that's only problematic if one considers a conspiracy by definition a negative action, right? So we don't associate surprise parties or gifts from Santa as conspiracies because they lack the elements of a conspiracy, but because they are positive events, right? You have people making decisions in secret. That seems pretty conspiratorial to me, but it's for something that's a positive, right? It's a positive outcome at the end of the day, okay? On the second point, it seems to, we have a lot of terms that we use in academic research and science and psychology. They're used in the general public, and they're not used as we as social scientists use them. And so I don't know that it's inherently invalidates that more precise use of the term. So how would you respond to someone kind of making those arguments?
Yeah, so this is the fault line, I think, in the philosophy of conspiracy theory literature. And I admit, I find it really hard to sort of get any traction with this issue. So basically, there's a question, getting meta-philosophical again, what are we trying to do when we're doing philosophy in the first place? And one camp, one approach starts from what do people actually do? How do we use these words? And that's kind of work backwards from that. So sometimes it's called ordinary language philosophy. This is like a 20th century thing that's pretty popular in American philosophy in particular. So if we start from how people use a term and try to make sense of that, like that's sort of one approach. And if that's what you're doing, then I think there is a built-in advantage for the generalists, because I think colloquially, when people use the term conspiracy theory, they mean it in a negative way. You're absolutely right, though, that especially when we're doing academic work, we use jargon in all sorts of ways that the public doesn't. I'm sure we've all in class had a student, say beg the question when it means raise and not the fallacy, that kind of thing. So, sometimes let's disambiguate, fine. I think what the particularists are trying to do is a little bit revisionary. So they basically accept that the way they are talking about what conspiracy theory as a term means isn't the way people use it. And that's okay, because it's a pre-theoretical phenomenon we haven't investigated yet. And once we did, we see that most people are wrong about it the way they are about all sorts of things. It's fine. Let's revise the way that we talk to be more accurate, right? Better sense of how the world really is. And it's sure, yes, fine. That's okay. We do that all the time. But at some point, we're just not talking about the same thing anymore. You've sort of changed the subject of what we're talking about, or you've smuggled some stuff in. So we're sort of ambiguous, right? We're talking about two different things, or maybe we're conflating two different topics under the same label. So I think in this particular case, since conspiracy theory is an inherently social phenomenon, in the sense that people use this term to do some stuff, we're trying to figure out what that is and what sense it makes to do it that way. It makes sense to keep ourselves tethered to the way the term has actually been used that does have that negative connotation. And we might contrast that with, all sorts of scientific things. Like, what is water? And for most of human history, people didn't know anything about atoms. They didn't really know what water was, and so they define it in some silly ways. The scientists maybe have shown us that means something else, and we know better, and that's okay. I don't think conspiracy theories are like that. I think the way the common sense term, or the folk term it's sometimes used, is a real phenomenon, and we should stick to it.
Okay. All right. So put my political science hat on here for a second. As often happens, political partisans, as other kinds of interested individuals or organizations will take concepts or terms like conspiracy theory, which social scientists work to precisely define, and convert them into weapons against their opponents and misapply them, right? So an example that stood out to me when I was reading your paper was, I remember back when the idea that COVID-19 was possibly the result of a leak from a virus in a lab in China, there were so many people in government and science and media that immediately cried, "That's a conspiracy theory. You're just a conspiracy theorist." Well, 4 years later, we've got multiple government agencies who have come out and said this looks like it might be the most plausible way this occurred. You have others who've done their own independent research, scientists who've come to that conclusion. And we can say at least that possibility is as plausible as the animal to human transmission that was the dominant viewpoint early on. This seems to kind of favor the particularist approach, if I understand it correctly, by insisting on, you have to evaluate these claims on their merits, not just broadly cast the net. Oh, that obviously is a conspiracy theory, or you miss something. And so how do we prevent that kind of distortion of this use or concept of conspiracy theories? How do we not fall into the trap of allowing people to just dismiss things they don't want to address by labeling it conspiracy theory?
Yeah. So I think one thing that motivates the particularists that I think they're right about is using a label just as a cudgel is not great. And lots of people can use that for lots of reasons in lots of different ways. And so if we, as a whole society, we're all on board with, if it's a conspiracy theory, it's inherently unlikely and therefore don't investigate it. And then we can just all start labeling all sorts of things conspiracy theories. We're going to miss a lot. I think that is a danger. And so one thing that is important, I think, is we have to be responsible about how we label things as a conspiracy theory in the first place. So like in the lab leak hypothesis example, and I'll have to say I am a philosopher. I am not I am not a botanist, not a biologist, neither of those, not an epidemiologist. So what do I know? So I remember when that was first coming out, there's sort of two strands of it. One was the sort of political level where basically, I don't know if it was entirely Trump, but it was very like politically driven. Oh, it's the Chinese, it's their fault, which never really got traction, which surprised me. But you could see this like, okay, well, if it's their fault, they're held responsible, therefore it's not my fault. They're out to get us, the evil foreigners, who don't look like us. They're the bad guys. And you could just see it being the like pass the buck scapegoating. Right. Oh, that doesn't look very good.
I think the term China flu came out a couple of times, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And you could just like, guys, do we have to be like, this is so ham-handed and obvious what we're doing here. So there was that level. And then I think below that or parallel to that, there was the more legitimate, like, hey, we need to figure this out because we want to know what actually happened, because maybe it's important to, we need to know to treat the disease. We need to know to prevent the next outbreak, things like that. And so that's when scientists and journalists start really digging into the details, right? And at least my sense of how it went down was there were plenty of people talking about the lab leak hypothesis as a viable hypothesis, right? So I don't know, it was what the percentage of people, but lots of popular pundits that I follow on Twitter were talking, like Nate Silver, those kind of, they were talking about it. They thought it was legit. It was out there. They were disagreed with, but I never got the sense that it was completely dismissed. Right? It was more of like, I guess like 80-20, we don't need to keep arguing about this. Or it's 70-30, like, we can't completely rule it out, but, preponderance of evidence, it seems like this way is more probable than that. And I remember these maps, it's been a while, but like, here's a map of like where the market was and where the lab was and where the first cases were reported, like really deep dive empirical investigation. So that was all happening at the same time that it was being labeled a conspiracy theory, right? So I'm not in a position to evaluate how good each side actually was. I've got the voices I trust and I sort of listen to them, fine. But it didn't seem like the label was as rhetorically dangerous, rhetorically effective as it looked. I think it didn't actually prevent people from digging into it and arguing about it the way the particulars might have worried.
Well, I like your kind of bifurcation here. You had kind of the political theater of I'm going to push responsibility off on this other group, and we're going to push that. And the way that was presented could sound fairly conspiracy theorist, right? But at the same time, you have more serious people who are just trying to figure out what happened. And for now, I think, unfortunately, how we consume information is not necessarily how the average person consumes information. Because I'm like you, a lot of the folks that I listened to were very balanced. They said, here's the thing. The New York Times did a great piece on outlining the pros and cons of each side of this argument that I thought was just fantastic. But it felt like for a while there, those that were taking seriously that lab leak theory were caught up under the more political, type of, you're just one of those Trump people, rather than, okay, let's evaluate this. Now, that seems to have died down some at this point. But I do like the way you've kind of set that and said, here's how these two things were going on at the same time, but one kind of got lumped under the other for a period of time before we moved out of that.
Yeah. And actually, let me add another layer to this, another distinction. It's one of the things philosophers do best, to just make distinctions all over the place, right? So like, even what is the lab leak hypothesis as a conspiracy theory, I think is kind of ambiguous between, there's one option of the, Chinese government or some Chinese lab, it was their fault and they covered it up because they didn't want the world to know that this is where it originated. And maybe, it's biological weapons research or something could be more nefarious. So the conspiracy is the Chinese government did it and covered it up. Right? What I remember people talking about this was this sort of second level sort of meta debate. The evidence that the Chinese government was responsible versus the evidence that it was just natural animal transmission. That debate is itself being suppressed, or maybe thumbs on the scale, like the media, the people who are, what was the name of it? Like the natural transmission. It's something Jetic article.
Yeah.
I remember, like those guys, the people who are on that side, they're getting on all the media play. They're on CNN. They get the bylines, and the lab leak people, they're being quieted or suppressed or something like that. So the conspiracy is actually at the level of what the media are doing to let us talk about that.
Yeah.
And that one to me was more vivid because I remember there were a couple of pundits, I shan't name names, but you could just tell, like, at least seemed to me that they weren't really concerned about like the science of what happened. They're like, I was right and no one listened to me. And why aren't you inviting me on your podcast to talk about this? I was vindicated. So point is, like, where exactly the conspiracy is it about the thing that happened, or is it about the way people talk about the thing that happened? There's often two of those going on parallel too.
And there's all sorts of nuance that can fly in there, right? Because it's not, you have these folks who are like, it was an accident and it occurred. Then you have the folks that know this was biomedical, or they were trying to create a weapon. And then you have, what was the Chinese government's response to that later on top. And so there's all sorts of ways this can go. And I think, what I saw as unfortunate, and I do like, again, I really appreciate your explanation of kind of what this parallel track that's going on at the same time, is that, as some people are trying to make sure we blame the right people, what the evidence was saying was not always the first point, right? That was not always what we were worried about. And I think there's still a little bit of that in this conversation. And I know, from what I read and listened to, there was some hesitancy within the media, not so much to discuss a lab leak, but they could see plainly the administration, or at least the president at the time, Donald Trump, clearly trying to blame, China, and not necessarily making a clear distinction between China and the Chinese people. And the media was really hesitant about discussing anything that might lead to this kind of broad-based hostility towards Chinese people in general, Chinese Americans, that kind of thing, or just Asian Americans in general. And so all of that played into how this kind of played out, I feel like.
Yes, and we all learned a valuable lesson and never scapegoated a minority for having weird interactions with animals ever again.
Jerry, in the interest of time, I want to jump ahead to make sure we had part of the discussion I wanted to get to. Your paper is not a direct offense of the general's position, but I take it it's an indirect offense. So I'm guessing you are sympathetic to the generalist camp, and that you think that there are maybe some suspicious things epistemically or evidentially about conspiracy theories. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so.
I would love a chance to give you a few of my basic beefs with conspiracy theories as I think the generalists are characterizing them. And I just want to know, do you share that beef? Do you think I'm off? Do you think I'm missing some of the beef? James, jump in here as you like as well. Okay, I got 4 or 5 of these. First of all, I'm guessing you're familiar with what we call the conjunction fallacy, where people make the mistake of thinking like 2 events, A and B, are somehow more likely than just one of those events by itself. It's obvious in cases when you say, like, if you flip a coin, what are the chances of landing heads or tails? Somebody says 50-50. And then you say, like, well, what's the chance of landing heads and George Washington is facing due north? That's clearly less likely. But there are other sort of lab demonstrations where people will absolutely commit that exact fallacy and judge that a more complex event must be more likely than a more simple event. It strikes me that this has to be happening in some cases with conspiracy theories. So what's more likely, that nuclear war breaks out in the next 10 years? Or is it more likely that it breaks out in the Middle East, starts in Iran, and then spreads from those kinds of conflicts? And people's like, oh, that sounds right to me. And when you get into conspiracy theories, it seems like they're so elaborate that something like that has to be going on. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so let me make another distinction. Sorry. What counts as a conspiracy theory versus how do people attracted to conspiracy theories think? So how do conspiracy theorists tend to reason? And once you're looking at how reasoners think, there are lots of studies that show all sorts of logical problems. So people who are willing to, and they've gone both directions, people who are willing to endorse conspiracy theories make these logical errors in that order. Or also, wow, we study these people, they have these logical errors. Oh, and then we ask them if they believe this conspiracy, they say yes. So conjunction fallacy is one of them, just believing contradictions. Like a famous one, I remember, Princess Diana faked her own death and is also was murdered by the queen.
I remember that. Yeah,
she either did or she's alive or she's not, and they think both.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so I put the next set together because I think they all run kind of in the same direction. It also strikes me as that there's just an entirely different kind of inquiry going on the part of the conspiracy theorist compared to, say, like what a scientist is doing. So in the case of like social science, hard science, and even the armchair, scare quotes, sciences that we have to do, we absolutely have to start as though we are wrong about this. We have to assume we're not finding anything, and we have to adopt squarely the burden of proof and try to establish that, like, say, no, we found something here. So in the case of like social science, this is what all the statistical tools are doing. You have to assume that, say, there's no effect whatsoever. And then you've got to show statistically that, like, no, we've got reason for thinking this is not an accident. This is not a fluke. And we can actually quantify that. And it strikes me as conspiracy theorists take on the exact opposite sort of take. Like, oh, I'm clearly right about this. You show me where this is not happening. What evidence is showing me that it's not lizard people or whatever. So they don't assume burden of proof. And they talk as though, like, I'm the skeptic here, but it's like entirely selective what they're going to be skeptical about. And then once you provide any more like probable explanation, you find out that like somehow that counter evidence somehow gets counted as evidence for conspiracy. So it's just, they're not falsifiable. If like I don't actually find the smoking gun of, say, the Satanist cabal in the 80s that are harming all the children, that's just because they're so good at hiding it. So like, I don't know how you go about actually doing any investigating as in this. It seems like a problem.
Exactly. No, and I think one of my pet peeves is it stands to reason sort of inference, where it could be, it's possible, and therefore it's okay for me to believe it. So it's not, is my evidence good enough to merit it, but just, am I allowed to do it at all? If you can't rule it out, then it's fine. Leave me alone. And then you're absolutely right about the selective skepticism. Like, well, you can't believe the media, blah, blah, blah. Well, why do you think that? Because I saw this YouTube video and my aunt on Facebook, she told me. You think they're more credible? Yeah. So it's this weird mix of skepticism and gullibility that I think don't line up in very neat ways.
Okay. Well, I also think that what you get in a lot of them anyway, maybe not every single one, but in a lot of conspiracy theories, you get this very oversimplistic cast of like how the world is, that you just get. So the folks out there that are the bad guys, they're not just bumbling idiots who wanted a fast shortcut and just decided like, if we conspire, that would make it easier. They have to be like mustache twirlingly evil people. And then there's just this other massive class of people on the earth, and those are the sheep. And then the conspiracy theorists, these are like the sort of like white knights who finally figured out the truth and are fighting the good fight. Like, and nobody who's a conspiracy theorist and says like, and you know what, I'm one of the sheep, it turns out.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that just strikes me as like missing the utter nuance of how people are.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. What do you think about that?
No, so there's a lot of in-group, out-group stuff going on there. Just oversimplifying in general is something that a lot of people do. I remember when I was teaching this stuff, I took it out of my class for a little bit when sort of Pizzagate was in the news.
Yeah, Pizzagate.
This isn't fun anymore, you guys. This is gross. I don't want to have to talk about it was so demoralizing to see. Like, I think the tax rate should be lower. Great. I value, I'm more worried about immigration than whatever. Like, okay, we can talk about that. You are literally killing children and drinking their blood in order to. Do we really need to go there to like vote differently? Like, oh, it was really frustrating. So yeah, that one's the worst one. I think it makes me sad that people think that way about other people.
Okay, well, what do you think about this one? And let me put it this way. Sometimes when I hear conspiracy theories touted, I just feel like I'm hearing a person who has just like never been a project manager before. Like, so my favorite one's the Satanic Panic. So I'm thinking about how like the folks who really were believing the children were undergoing, say at daycares, all this kinds of abuse. And then when you put together like what kids were saying happened, I mean, in some cases, like in the San Antonio case, I think kids were claiming like, oh yeah, we got in helicopters and flew to Mexico and dug up the bodies in the cemetery there and then mutilated them and then came back. And you sit there and you think like, have you ever tried to get like 8 children to do something promptly without like crying for 20 minutes about putting their shoes on? And somehow they managed to all get into this helicopter and be back in time for mom and dad. And just when you hear like how like you hear like what's supposed to happen, but what you don't hear from conspiracy theorists is like the mechanism by mechanism, step by step. And how would that actually happen?
Right. Just, yeah, no, you're right. And it's like, in some ways it's so complicated and in other ways it's so easy. And like, there are all these people and they're so sneaky and they're so powerful and no one can catch them except for me. I figured it, right? They're savvy enough to sneak by everyone else, but not savvy enough to get by you. And it's like, rando who lives in the middle of nowhere, like how is it that you're the one who figures this out when they didn't? So it's another one of these places I think where it's not that they're just doing one thing. It's like they're doing two opposite things in this inconsistent or almost even hypocritical way. Like when it works, they'll apply one standard, and then when it doesn't work, they'll flip and do the opposite standard, and there's no consistency.
Well, okay, on that note, so that leads me into, I think, which is my biggest beef. And this really, I think, only applies to sort of like the super grand conspiracies. We're talking about wildly powerful conspirators who just have almost infinite resources, right? And people really get invested in some of those conspiracy theories. And a lot of the times I just want to say like, well, so what then? Like, okay, even if you're right, should I like stop all my hobbies? Should I quit going to my kid's cello recital? It sounds like there's zero we can do about this. So I don't know what good is actually happening. What good is coming of this?
Yeah, this is a whole second episode conversation of belief as a proxy for action. I figured it out and therefore I've done something. I figured it out and therefore I'm one of the good guys. There's also an element I feel like of contrarianism or even arrogance. Like I'm the only one smart enough to figure it out. Nobody else has. So it doesn't. There's a natural step too that you would want to ask about. Like, okay, so what? Like, the government's run by lizard people. Should we build a lizard people detecting machine or something? Like,
Yeah.
we should maybe do something about it. And yeah, they don't ever get that far because it's at some level. I think a lot of people who say they endorse conspiracy theories actually don't. There's an interesting paper. This guy named Neil Levy. It's sort of like the gamification of conspiracy theories, where like they suspend their disbelief to kind of play along in this almost like RPG sort of fanfic, like let's pretend the world is this way because it's more fun, it's more interesting, it makes me feel better about myself, that can then get sort of cordoned off so you don't have to deal with the real consequences of what we would need to do if it was right.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a cop-out. I mean, one maybe cause for optimism is the people who say they believe these conspiracy theories, probably fewer of them like really believe it than say that they do. They say they endorse it for just communicating or venting, letting off steam, telling you what political party they belong to, that kind of thing. They don't literally think it's happening.
Oh, so you think maybe a lot of this might just be like identity performative?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I suspect / hope that is the
Well,
case.
fair enough. Well, so those are my beefs. What did I miss? Do you have beefs that I'm just?
No,
on
I
my
mean,
radar?
there's just the three big categories. I think reasoning ability, and reasoning skills, I guess you would call them. There's something about epistemic character, like being gullible, being skeptical, being arrogant, things like that. And then there's the social epistemology side of who do you trust and what sources do you allow, and are you hypocritical about who you trust and who you don't. So I think probably everything about what at least the stereotypical conspiracy theory believer is going to check off one or all three of those boxes. I think that's all, like those three categories get pretty much everything. So we're just arguing about which goes in which one.
Well, that's all great stuff. In the interest of time, I want to offer James one last question before maybe we get to our secret question.
The ultimate question.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Do you have one last one? you
Yeah.
wanna
Let
fire
me, there's kind of two pieces of this. Number one, why are we so attracted to conspiracy theories? I mean, we love these things, right? And maybe that's the bottom line, is they're just a form of entertainment, right? But why do we like them? And then why is it that they're always about some evil secret plot? What is it about them that, there's never a conspiracy theory of people to make insulin shots free or to put gobs of money into poor people's bank accounts. Those are never the conspiracy theories that emerge, right? So what's going on there with us psychologically, philosophically, socially? What's happening that is pushing us to A, enjoy them so much, and B, to always have them as being something evil and bad?
Yeah. So I think motivated reasoning, and in particular, motivated reasoning that makes you look good or feel good, is a huge part of it. So I'm smart enough to figure it out. I haven't been tricked like all the sheep are. I'm different and special. It's a huge motivator. I can make sense of a chaotic world is both comforting and makes you feel good, right? So I think I'm sure there's many instances of this broad category, but the things that make us feel good, for at least some people, lead us to conspiracy theories. I think that's part of it. And then the other side of it is they make the world sound more interesting and also more black and white at the same time. So there's the good guys and the bad guys. It's all morally clear cut. Mm-hmm. So it simplifies in that way. And it often reduces lots of chaotic phenomenon to a simple, not simple, but like it's that group of people doing it. So it's a tractable explanation. And yet it lets us not confront actual complexity. So it's this sort of two-step of simplifying and avoiding complexity, mm-hmm. while also making it sound more interesting, but not really. So I don't know if I'm going to call it entertainment, but it's not far off from that. Just if we lived in a Marvel movie, it would be more interesting, where there actually is the secret cabal. Like that would be a better world than this one in some weird ways.
And that's interesting what you said. I like the point about the chaotic world. In other words, like it's kind of a security blanket because I don't have to face the fact that maybe really bad stuff in the world can happen just by accident when everybody was trying to do their best, or somebody was just a little bit incompetent and then major. In other words, like that sounds like a world out of control. Whereas the other picture sounds like there's it's all very agential and very controlled and very intentional. And that's how things work. Yeah. Interesting.
I just think, probably, I don't know if it is the most prominent, but it's seems to be one that lasts a long time, is theories about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Right. And there's no shortage of, and when I think of entertainment, I think because I see documentaries that are
scare quotes for the listeners at home.
Exactly, that are out there saying this is what really happened, and they're interviewing people and all of this. To some extent, I do think it's become some kind of form of entertainment. Maybe, obviously, not all of them, but in some of these have grown just so big that people have found A, I can make money off of this, right? And B, on my side, as person consuming that conspiracy, well, this is kind of fun. I can just kind of suspend belief and jump into this for a little bit, right? So it just seems that some of them have certainly went in that direction.
All right, it is time for our final question we ask all guests. I think I went last time. Why don't you ask this time?
Did you?
I'm pretty sure.
All right. So here's the setup. You're leaving the show, the podcast. You have two options. You're going to go home. You have two options. You can sit down and watch an episode of 30 Rock, or you can sit down and watch an episode of Seinfeld. Which one are you going to choose?
So as I mentioned at the beginning, I have listened to every episode of this podcast, so I knew it was coming, and I have been freaking out. How am I going to answer this? Because friendships are at stake here. Okay, so I'm going to make both of you mad.
Uh-oh.
So my answer is 30 Rock.
Okay.
Because I've never seen it.
Okay.
I have seen plenty of Seinfeld. I've only seen memes and clips of 30 Rock, never actually watched an episode.
Well, now, which I have not done to you before, I will now be barraging you with little clips.
Yeah, you're going to be in trouble
of 30 Rock.
And they are entertaining, let me just say. You won't regret what he says, for sure.
So are you going to count that for
me?
Yeah,
no, that counts.
Yeah.
That's
okay.
I know you're losing, but you're losing by less.
Yeah, that's right.
I think you're up by about 3 or so. Now, you said both of us mad. I was thinking about, was it Munger who said, like, I don't want to watch either one of those?
Yeah, well, he said he hadn't seen either one.
Oh,
Yeah. Our guest today has been Professor Jerry Green from the University of Central Oklahoma, philosophy professor, talking about conspiracy theories. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Fantastic conversation.
A pleasure. This is fun.
All right. We'll see you next time.
See you next time, folks. Thanks for listening to Curiosity Porn with the two best intellectual pole dancers in the United States, Dr. Guy Crane and Professor James Davenport. If you'd like to share a comment about today's episode, suggest a guest or topic, or just leave a compliment or complaint, you can reach us at curprn@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you.